Very good. So co-living as a rental home experience is a paper that I've written together with Professor Turkka Keinonen. I'm from Aalto University, where I'm a doctoral student and part of the Department of Design, School of Arts. In this paper, I'm exploring kind of how smart home technologies and how they connect to the smart city and how that can affect sort of landlord relationships and autonomy of the residents. And to just begin with, there's a lot of intersection between smart houses and smart housing. And housing is, of course, the general housing stock. And in this particular study, I'm looking at a larger housing building. So it's not just a singular apartment, but rather a housing solution of co-living. And these smart housing solutions, they tend to have kind of three focuses. And it's efficiency, flexibility, and convenience. And they can intersect, and some solutions are focused on several of these things, but to essentially say that it's either more effective solutions or that you should be more flexible with how you're living, what you're doing, or that it should just be more convenient. You should maybe save time, so convenience. I've seen smart city solutions that, for instance, say that we're promising you an extra hour of freedom every day. So flexibility and convenience and efficiency are all sort of intermingled into these kind of topics. And then to continue a little bit with the smart home and what the smart home does and what it is. And it's then I think important to realize that the smart home is not just technology. The smart home is a technical assemblage. It's economical, political, and technological apparatuses, and social ones as well, that then work together. Like our practice, how we live, are a part of the smart home. So they are done in many ways. And it is rather the applications and through technology that defines kind of the smart home, but many of these things are present in a traditional home that the smart home kind of to some degree attempts to replace. But the most common applications are either security, like smart locks, cameras or utilities where you can maybe track your water or energy consumption or heating, conveniences or appliances such as interconnected fridges or laundry machines, or even windows that are sort of utility like appliances. And then leisure, which I think is important to consider as speakers, lighting, smart TVs. These are all, even if they're not part of the physical house as you build it, you put them in there and they're part of the smart house or the smart home. And in most cases, smart housing is especially considered promising for supporting seniors. And this study is not about seniors. It's rather about looking at what happens when it goes beyond seniors. Because for many seniors, it's kind of motivated as well. We'll surveil them, we'll take away some of their agency, but in return, they get to live in their own home. They get independence in a different form. And that the smart housing has kind of porous boundaries. It can kind of detect when you're leaving or when you're entering the home, and some of the technology you can interact with the technology of your home from outside the home, and therefore the boundary of the home is not the four walls. It's very porous, and therefore the boundary between what is public, what is private, what is shared can shift quite a bit, especially if you can control like communal spaces with smart technologies. And in public housing, where there's been quite a few studies, smart housing can shift the expectations of what it takes to participate in the public life. And by that, it can, if you suddenly need to use a phone or a computer to engage with some of the technologies, then there's an expectation that you can have that you can afford that, and that you have that. And it's important to consider what are the expectations of participation in a public life. what is required to have and what is not expected or required to have. And we try to kind of look at this from this idea of a protection and appreciation space. What kind of technologies augment the agency or the autonomy of the residents, or their freedoms to do what they want? What kind of technologies protect them from negative consequences? And in the best case, a good technology should really do both of these two things, thereby nurturing them. But many technologies that are not necessarily ready might be exciting to use, but does not protect you from negative consequences. So you can make mistakes, for instance, that have major negative impacts, or you might be cushioned as in you're protected, but you're not really allowed to do what you want. And it is our homes that we're talking about. Housing is about our homes, and we should be able to, live the kind of lives that we want within autonomy. And if they do neither of these things, they become very easily quite exploitative. And this is a framework that we adapted from Turkka Keinonen's older work to explore as a way of kind of understanding how some of these technologies affect the residents. And I also want to stress something that within this paper, I'm talking about what is referred to as co-living. And this is sometimes interchangeably referred to as co-housing. And I want to stress that these are quite different. Co-living, as this study is about, is a market solution by landlords. It's essentially a building where the building is owned by a company or a landlord with this kind of smart technologies as a solution to sort of how it's set up, where you have a small studio and there's often common workspaces or common areas, kitchens, depends on the solution. Maintenance and service of these spaces is part of the contract. And in previous iterations, this has been common as student housing, guest workers, and so on. But oftentimes, I will add also that when it's referred to as co-living, the target audience is often somewhat wealthier. It sort of attempts to climb up a social class, if you wish. Co-living is often marketed as kind of a luxurious inner city solution, since it gives you more space, or at least claims to give you more space, despite the very small private areas and a community. And it has been criticized quite heavily because it's as creating kind of spaces where the focus is efficiency, the focus is being productive. This is a space where you can live and work. This is not a space for intimacy. It is primarily also targeting people who do not have a family life, but rather single housing people. Whereas co-housing, on the other hand, is generally more shared bottom-up initiatives from the residents. The residents own the community. It's a great focus on communal efforts and very often family life. So these are quite different. And I want to stress that what I'm talking about when I talk about co-living is the first here. And while looking at this, we came with two research questions. And how is smart housing affecting the relationship with tenants and service providers in a co-living housing model? And how does this affect the autonomy of the residents? And I'll kind of go through a little bit of the data and how we reach some conclusions in this direction as well. And here you can see what kind of data. It's roughly 20 to 40 square meters per studio. And there's quite a lot of services involved. There's workspaces, saunas, gyms, bicycles, mandatory cleaning service within the apartment, and so on. And all of this is bundled, so you only pay one bill, and it's quite important to note. And there's no queue, so it's first come, first serve in kind of an online booking system. And anyone who lives in a major city in any part of the world that wants housing knows that it's often very hard. There's often long housing queues, so it's not necessary. So that convenience is quite heavily marketed as well, that you don't necessarily need to have stood in line for several years. And in a result, we realized there were three aspects that sort of shape the autonomy. And the first one of this is the contract. They're flexible. You don't necessarily need to sign a long-term contract. If you're uncertain about how long you're going to, what kind of life you're having in the next years, you get access to that. And you often also get access to a community through this. That it circumvents the time-consuming process of apartment hunting. You just sign up and you know that you know what you're going to get. But at the same time, because these buildings are actually zoned as commercial rather than residential buildings, this negates many regulations protecting tenants, like tenant rights. You can be evicted with very short notice. You're not actually eligible for unemployment benefits in this case, because it's not your home. You cannot register your permanent address there. Therefore, the rent does not contribute to what you're supposed to get as unemployment benefits. Bear in mind that this is done in a Nordic context where there's quite a bit of these benefits and you can get help with the rent. And that civic participation actually can become more difficult, because if you haven't registered as a resident in the city, you might be registered with your family. And if your family does not live in the same city, you actually don't have the right to vote either, or you can have a harder time finding a parking space, and other things are actually bundled because of how the contract works. And it's important to consider that when I talk about the social technical solution assemblage, this is a part of that assemblage. I know that I'm slightly behind on time. The second part of this is community. And it gives you a lot of things. That if you're new to a city or you don't know so many people, you get quick access to a community, and that really corresponds to this convenience. You get other people who live in small apartments that live in the same building, and they kind of have a need for the communal area. So you quickly get to know some people. But it's then important to realize that this community is managed by the landlord, not the residents. And this kind of becomes a selling point, or even a commodification of the social life. Your social life, if you live there, is something that they are selling. It's a commodity. And the code of conduct is not only made by the residents. I mean, they can make suggestions, but it is something that is enforced by the landlord in the interest of how does it preserve value in the building for the landlord, not necessarily the same as for the residents, which also means that they have, in this case, surveillance systems and cameras in all the communal areas, which are supposed to be their home, to ensure that the residents are actually following the rules that they have set up. And the last aspect of this is kind of how the space changes. Because the idea of private, shared, and public space shift quite significantly. The private spaces, the studio is actually not, in this case, fully private. It's not a private space that you can entirely choose who enters and leaves, because the mandatory cleaning service that several of the residents actually recognize is not for cleaning. It's a surveillance system. It's a non-technological surveillance system, but it's kind of to ensure that the apartment or the studio is well maintained, that is clean. But also that all of these shared spaces are now semi-public. They don't have control over who goes and enters these communal spaces, and they're not managed by their own rules. So the idea of what is a private space, what's a communal space, has somewhat changed. And to be clear also that it is not just cameras, but also like the locks and of how you move through the space is surveilled. If someone's fire alarm goes off, they can tell, was your fan on in the kitchen, or is it your fault that the fire alarm went off? Because they can see this in the tablet. You can see what are the temperatures you maintain in your apartment. And this is quite problematic of how much insight the landlord then gets. And this is again tied to the contract. It's zoned as a commercial area. In a hotel, this is not an issue. But in a private apartment, this would be an issue. And all of these things are interconnected in this way. So then to go back to this protection appreciation spaces, I try to sort of see what are there some technologies that maybe excite? Are there some technologies that cushion the users, some to exploit, and maybe some that also nurture? And we found that when we were looking at this, most of them are either exploitative. The model in itself is kind of exciting to some because it's quite new. It offers this flexibility, it offers community, but at the same time, they leave them without protection and open to be exploited. The community kind of cushions them from finding other ways throughout the city. And when they move out, several of the residents all expressed that when they moved in, they stopped being as close with their friends outside the building. And then they noted that when someone moved out, they sort of also no longer quite have actual access to that community. And these surveillance technologies kind of do reinforce that they're not in charge of their living space. And that also negatively affects the autonomy of the residents. So that's my presentation, and I don't know how far I am over time, but I think that hopefully there's time for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nils, for interesting presentation. And I can say it touches me personally because one of my sons as a student just moved in Madrid for 1 year and started using this co-living space. And actually, I didn't find a lot of examples of smart technology in your presentations currently related to these smart technologies. And so far, I have learned that there's a co-washing machine in this co-living space. So my question is, what type of smart technology you could suggest to landlords of these co-living spaces to make the habitants' life more enjoyable, although they lose in their private space?
Well, I think the primary point should be that when they implement these technologies, they need to put the residents actually in charge of them. And that's the core point. It doesn't really matter which technology, that the organizational aspects are something where they are in charge, because even the sound systems and the lighting in these spaces is programmed to, at certain times it gets louder in the evening at 5-ish to indicate work time is over, to kind of program their behavior. At 10 it closes down. They can hijack this, but it is because these technologies are not in something that the residents are in charge of. And that should be the point, that what technology do they want? How do they control it? What are they in charge of?
Thank you. And also Ralph Martin has raised his hand, so please.
Yes, thank you. I think this is a very interesting topic, and indeed one of the positive sides is that this IoT hype and IoT city has not realized as it was planned 5 years ago, and it seems it will not realize it as well. But that was kind of a hype that all devices will communicate with everyone, everybody, devices, people, and so on. And that would be like a very scary environment in terms of data privacy and so on. But I think this is one very good example that there are actual issues, and very often it is not something that has been planned like this, but there are more like consequences. And the same is with like a rental market in Estonia as well in terms of electricity consumption. Currently, most of owners can have close to real-time overview on the electricity consumption of their tenants. And that's a question that so first of all, most owners don't know it, and secondly, most tenants don't know it. But it still is a question that you know, it's if you put it into the kind of if you know what it is and if you can analyze it, it's a very sensitive information. You can understand everything what is going on based on the electricity consumption. But another thing is that when Janika was asking about the technologies, maybe something that or like a follow-ups, maybe something that could be like learned further is this digital rights concept that, for example, Francesca Bria has been promoting when she was chief technology officer in Barcelona, and now she's like a visiting professor in UCL. So that's exactly the case. But what are the digital rights? And the second one is actually that has rooted in Finland as well, is this my data concept, but who owns my data, and how can actually I myself define who and how has access to my data? Because that like conceptually solves the problem, but on our hand, as said, and I've been looking into this electricity data exchange as well, but nobody thought about this. It's like, it's just like, and if you don't define it up front, it's very complex. But yeah, sorry for this long comment. It's more comment than question, but yeah, it's indeed is very important.
Yeah, and I think I comment on that there was some Dutch researchers that noted that smart electricity tracking, essentially, that they wanted to implement all over the Netherlands a couple of years ago, they deemed that as a crime against human rights, or like in contradiction to human rights, because in terms of privacy. The other part, like, I agree about that part about smart data, or like my data, but the problem there becomes that how much of the burden should we place? How much labor, how much understanding do people actually have? And I think that is important to consider, that most people are not quite that data literate, and maybe we shouldn't expect them to be.